great to have Kelly Dixon here today from University of Montana. She's been really active in the IOE, and she's one of the more dynamic people in the IOE. I think you'll see when she talks. She's a historical archaeologist and specializes in the archaeology.
No, it's just, I really don't know.
She has interest in the archaeologies of adaptation, colonization, colonialism, landscapes, landscape transformation, human-environment interactions, boomtowns, extractive industries, marginalized populations, and does text-aided approaches to archaeology. And one thing that I really like about Kelly is she's really actively involved in training and educating people about the historical and archaeological resources and cultural resources in the state. She gives field courses involving tribal colleges and other people, and so it's really great to have her here today. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me over. For everybody in Missoula, there's snow on the ground here. I didn't expect that crunchy, icy feeling under my feet this morning. So, yes, I have many tales to tell you today. And by the way, we have about 45 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. As opposed to 3 hours.
Yeah, no.
So I'm starting out with a visual of the extent of transcontinental railroads across the American West. This comes courtesy of Stanford's Spatial History Project. They, for years, have been integrating historical topics with GIS so that we can have a good visual examination and understanding of many things, in this case, railroads. What we have done with this map is added another layer to give everybody a sense of annual precipitation, and it's very interesting to look at that in conjunction with the transcontinentals. The field sites that I have been dealing with include the Central Pacific over here in the Lake Tahoe area, the Sierra Nevada Donner Summit, as well as up here on the Northern Pacific Railroad in the northwestern part of Montana. If we have time, or if you ask questions, I would be happy to talk about what the heck is going on over here in the Donner area, but my intent today is to keep us here in Montana and stick with the mission of the IOE. There's another site over here in eastern Montana that I may or may not get to. It is a historic inscription site, so it doesn't have much overlap with ecosystems, but it's another interesting story when you consider the context of cultural and heritage that I'm about to drop on all of you. So, just real quickly, I figured it might be good to define archaeology since I was speaking to a group of non-specialists today. The image in the background is from Pompeii, kind of an iconic take on archaeology. I'm not going to be talking about Pompeii today. I'm going to be taking you to river floodplains in Montana, where we don't even have to excavate because there are still artifacts from the railroad era sitting there on the surface. And I'm here with an archaeological field methods class. That site was taken less than 2 weeks ago. So I literally have some hot off the presses information to share with you guys in the name of Rough Cut. But we basically study the past through archaeological remains, material remains. That includes artifacts, things made by humans, but it also includes what they ate and left behind, ecofacts, animal bones. If we're lucky, we find features like a cooking hearth or even an outhouse where we take soil samples and we do pollen analysis and we try to really understand what they were eating, etc. And their standing structures, of course. Now, Kathy noted that I am a text-aided archaeologist. What the heck does that mean? The text-aided archaeologists are people like Egyptologists who use ancient texts in tandem with archaeology to understand the past. I've given you a very tiny view of the Rosetta Stone to kind of underscore ancient texts. Mayanists used a Mayan script to understand the life in Mesoamerica. Assyriologists use cuneiform script from the Near East. Classical archaeologists study ancient Greek and Roman. Sinologists study Chinese. And then we get to the more recent past here. Medieval Europe, we're here. Historic sites. What the heck has happened in the last 500 years during the Age of Exploration? And industrial archaeology, sidebar, I have a Master of Science in Industrial Archaeology. What the heck happened since the Industrial Revolution? A lot when you consider the social and the racial and the economic implications, but don't get me started on the environmental implications of this kind of a study. Now, thankfully, I don't have to learn ancient Egyptian or ancient cuneiform to use text-aided approaches to this archaeology. We have historic newspapers, historic maps, photos that actually can help us understand the context of what we're getting at. As a starter kit for you, I pulled an excerpt from a historical newspaper from Portland, Oregon, that is talking about the Northern Pacific grading crews in Montana in 1882. As they were advancing along the Clark Fork River, I'll show you some maps in a minute to take you in a bit closer. But they were hitting the western boundaries of the Flathead Reservation. Apparently, there were some 6,000 Chinese and 1,400 non-Chinese laborers building this section of line. And I didn't highlight this part, with 1,000 loose women and men hanging around on the ragged edges. What happened is the Indian agent for the reservation knew this was coming. You could hear these rowdy camps coming, and the reservation then was dry, and he did not want these rowdy, drunken camps coming onto the dry reservation. So there's an interesting turn in history here. They hired Mormon crews to come in and help on the reservation. A point that I would like to come back to if possible. This is just a historic image of one of the railroad camps on one of the Transcontinentals. Not Northern Pacific, for full disclosure, this is Central Pacific. We don't have a lot of imagery of the camps that I'm studying. There is this issue doing historical archaeology. Why bother doing archaeology if everything is already written down in historical records? And my answer to that is, can we believe everything in historical records? And if you look at the historical records that were written about marginalized people like the Chinese who were working on these sites, it doesn't paint a very good picture, doesn't paint a very realistic picture. Archaeology in this case is used as a tool to democratize history. But I'm going a little social archaeology on you, and that's not the point of the IOE. Stanford University, a few years ago, embarked on this major international project to understand the story of the Chinese railroad workers in North America. Leland Stanford himself was one of the great railroad barons who was there hammering in the golden spike at Promontory Point, Utah, when the Central and the Union Pacific met in 1869. He was worth something like between $20 and $30 million in 1880, and that isn't translated to today's prices. He formed Stanford University to honor his son who had died. There's a whole interesting story there that we don't have time to get into, but his fortune was made on the blood, sweat, and tears of these thousands of Chinese laborers. So now we get to the 21st century. The Asian Studies Department, the American Studies Department, the History Department at Stanford wants to valorize their contributions, not only to Stanford as a university, but to American history. And so they started looking into it. They tried to find diaries or journals written by these railroad workers. They're looking into descendants who might have oral histories. And can you believe they can't find one journal or diary by any of the written by any of the railroad workers? So they had to go slumming and call the archaeologists, because many of us who've been working in the field for years have seen these Chinese sites, not just on the railroads, but in any extractive industries. Somebody like me with a degree in industrial archaeology got a job with the Forest Service out west because I needed to document industrial historic sites. mining, logging, railroads, charcoal making for the railroads. And I crash coursed in Chinese material culture because so many of these were Chinese. I felt like I couldn't throw a stone without hitting a Chinese site. So the Stanford archaeologists told the non-archaeologists this story, and they put together this wonderful interdisciplinary delegation. We've gotten together for several years. We've traveled to China, where the railroad workers came from, and there's now this transnational project going on. I'm going to switch now and talk about the environment for a minute. The Helena Independent in August of 1882, and I see my animation isn't on this slide. This is why this is rough cut, right? I'm going to take this out of here for a minute. I'm going to go back into the slideshow. So this is a historic image showing the Northern Pacific Railroad construction as it was in the 1880s. Accompanying this image is this snippet from the Helena Independent. For more than 20 miles, workmen are seen digging, chopping, lifting, blasting, cursing, and shouting. Trees crashing down, earth is flying, huge rocks being riven. Men, hundreds in a gang, proceed to mow down the forest, and the trees are felled with surprising rapidity. Broad swath is opened up, and now comes thousands of Chinese laborers to level the earth. Paints a pretty good picture of the environmental impacts on this roughly 200-foot wide swath that represented the path of these great transcontinentals. My earlier image was a close-up of this, and it was a group of Chinese railroad workers that you can't see very well, but they are definitely in this image. Another series of historical documents we use are the GLO, or the General Land Office survey maps, and this is where I promised to sort of show you where we're going here. Shown here. Here's the area of research sites in northwestern Montana where the Northern Pacific Railroad runs along the Clark Fork River and then along the Flathead River after the confluence. What I think is interesting, and we don't have detailed information for it on the Montana sites, but at Cabinet Landing here, right on the Montana-Idaho border, the Spokane Falls Chronicle noted that the Chinese workers were fishing for anything they could, and adding to their meal options as they worked along the railroad. I will give you a related footnote in the Donner Summit area. Donner Summit is a rough place to live and drive unless you're a skier, and that's really fun. In the late 1860s, when the Chinese laborers were working there, it was a rough place to work, especially if you came from subtropical southern China, where they did. And one of the alpine lakes up there has carp in it that are not there as natives. They are there because the Chinese laborers planted them so they'd have fresh fish all of the time. So I think we have a lot of ecological repercussions of railroad labor that has yet to be deeply understood. One of our few images from Harper's Weekly in the 1880s gives us some snapshots of life along the Northern Pacific Railroad. I've given you another quote from the Helena Independent that just describes what the Chinese are doing. This is one image from a historical document that shows their tents, and then of course labor in action, and this is a grave site. One of Stanford's major questions has to do with how many people, Chinese people, really died along the railroad. The newspapers are contradictory and often sensationalized. Nobody has ever done a formal mortuary survey of the railroads. I have some ideas for that if somebody thinks about it and wants to ask me, though I don't think I would ever get to it in this lifetime. So this is a map of the Northern Pacific route, and we've got the broad Transcontinental shown here. I'm zooming in on what was Montana Territory to take you into the sites that I have here. These are the sites over in eastern Montana that I mentioned earlier that have inscriptions from Chinese railroad workers. The whole thing that's cool about that was when I was at one of these meetings in Stanford, and they were lamenting the fact that they couldn't find one journal or diary penned by these railroad workers, I could say, well, we have it carved in stone in Montana. So. Another view of our research sites, giving you some modern place names. I'm going to mostly be hanging out in the Plains Paradise area with some of the examples that I will share with you. Each of the triangles on this map represents an area where archaeological sites associated with Chinese railroad construction have been located. How do you know one of these sites when you see them? Well, first of all, before you even begin to survey to look for the artifacts, you have to take the landscape into consideration. One of the big challenges of building a railroad through the Rocky Mountains are the Rocky Mountains, the obstacles in the way. In many cases, the best way through the mountains was using extant river valleys and using those corridors. I don't know if it shows up very well for those of you in the cheap seats, but there's actually a train along this image in the Google Earth overview. So there's a set of tracks along here that the Northern Pacific built that's currently owned by Montana Rail Link and that Burlington Northern Santa Fe leases. But if you look along here, where are you going to camp? This is a pretty difficult place to camp. We've got a little peninsula jutting out here, and then we've got a floodplain back here. There's roughly 1.5 miles distance between these two options, and there are sites with Chinese artifacts at each of those two options. The way the railroads were constructed, if you can imagine it, is there's a camp, a loud and carousing camp that's set up that's racially segregated. The Chinese had one campsite, the others had others. Most of the Europeans and European Americans tended to camp together. Irish, Italian, Greek, as an example, Americans. And so they would have their camp set up and they would construct a section of grade, and then when that section of grade was complete, they'd leapfrog and they'd move the camp there and then set up another camp. So between 1.5 and 2 miles might separate these camps, but basically you have to use the landscape. You have to look first to figure out what the options were.
And where did the Scuzz camp?
The Scuzz?
The Scuzz, the loose women and...
Oh, yeah, the term I'd not heard before. Oh, the boarding house ladies. That's a great question. These are the kinds of details that are not in the historical records. These are the kind of details that I'm out there looking for on the ground. There are artifacts that are considered indicators of women versus indicators of men, and there is a whole group of archaeologists who have worked at historic brothels and can open up their trench coats and show you the material culture that represents an archaeological signature of prostitution if you really want to go there. I have yet to see any of those traces at these sites.
They're there.
They're there. I'm afraid they're underwater though. Oh. Yeah. But if you want to volunteer, I've got some ideas. So this is zooming in on that one particular peninsula, just to give you an idea of how the camps might have been set up. Thinking of the fact that there are thousands of railroad workers, some of the other historical documents say that the Chinese camped in smaller groups of maybe 50 to 100 people at a time, and maybe that was part of the leapfrog process. The reason I even have an inkling and understanding about these sites came way before the Stanford Railroad project started. This is something we've been thinking about for years. A railroad employee, an actual modern railroad worker who always wanted to be an archaeologist, started looking for archaeological sites in his employment with Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And he wasn't thinking about historical archaeology or Chinese sites, and I'm guessing he wasn't thinking about prostitution either. He was looking for pre-contact sites from American Indians who've used the land since time immemorial. And as he was out walking along the grade doing his job and looking for pre-contact artifacts, he started finding these other artifacts associated with the Chinese. I'll show you some images in a minute, and then hopefully you will all be trained up and ready to go. He was doing this in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, in addition to finding the artifacts, he found what he described as tent pads, a flat area, sometimes with metal pins still in the corners of the tent pads, and then artifacts strewn around them. I went back to this site with him to see if we could relocate some of the tent pads about a year ago, and I could only see one. The other ones that are in red dashed lines here were no longer visible, so that their locations are estimated. What was interesting though is where it says latrine ? There was a small depression in the ground that was not natural, that to me looks like a privy pit or latrine pit as I have seen them elsewhere. The dugout feature, I'm going to switch to another slide and show you this for a minute. Very subtle. You can see the Flathead River. You can see the Flathead River in the distance in the lower right-hand image. And I've tried to annotate this image for you. A dugout is basically this perfect rectangular square that's dug in the ground. It is not part of nature, and it's usually a signature that somebody dug something in place. In my work in the Sierra Nevada, we've seen these dugout features at other Chinese work camps. And there usually is one surrounded by tent pads. And the Chinese historians that I've been working with are arguing that the dugout features represent a winter adaptation. That it was so cold in the Sierra Nevada, and obviously here, by the way, they were working here in the winter of 1882-83, that the dugout features represent a communal area, maybe where everybody gambled and took meals together. They use the dugout itself as a form of insulation to stay out of the cold and stay out of the wind. So what we're doing is taking multiple lines of evidence, these very subtle archaeological traces, to try to pinpoint these sites. The obvious archaeological traces, of course, are the artifacts that are scattered on the surface. I'm going to point out a few things using the mouse here for our friends in Missoula. This area includes what look like funny little square bits of metal. Those are brass opium can fragments. The tools and shovels are pretty obvious. You'll see some white pottery and some brown pottery. White pottery here with blue, brown here, and then of course horseshoes. These are Chinese coins down in the bottom. And so the pottery was made in China for Chinese laborers. There were middlemen who would sell Chinese food products to the Chinese laborers because they wanted their own food, and it came in these large Chinese stoneware jars that they would then reuse as storage in the camps. They were still taking their meals out of Chinese rice bowls, and while we have some European manufactured and American manufactured artifacts at these sites, they kind of scream to you Chinese laborers because they are so distinct. And I've got a sample publication from the International Journal of Historical Archaeology that a PhD student working with me prepared as part of his dissertation, trying to tell the story of the Chinese in Montana in general, with the railroads just being a footnote to that. And he put out an all-points bulletin for people in the state to help. Do you have any information, any diaries, any journals? Bear in mind, this is still before Stanford call for that. And this gentleman who used to work for the railroad contacted him and said, this is this gentleman's photo. He said, I know where these sites are. I can identify the artifacts for you. And so we actually added him as an author in a full-on twist of Marxian-like archaeology. So Stanford ended up picking up this paper and learning about our work and saying, wow, somebody's actually publishing on Chinese railroad workers. We need that. And there are others doing it too. So this just takes you into one of the sites that's on a floodplain. In fact, this particular site was called Last Chance Camp. And it was called Last Chance because it was the last major camp before the Northern Pacific hit the Flathead Reservation. So it was the last chance for alcohol, so to speak. And these are some of the artifacts that were found on the surface there. some of that same kind of, the blue on white is called bamboo ware, just for those of you who want to brush up on your material culture. There's a small bracelet that I'm pointing out now to the people in Missoula, and I'll point out here, that's fashioned from some strands of wire twisted together, a random collection of artifacts. There's a suspender clasp that I've just put the cursor or the pointer on from Missoula right there. So we get bits and bobs, not the full complete Pompeii picture, but if you know what these artifacts are, even the fragments become very valuable. We've got fragments from bottles here. You notice how the bottle fragments look black? That's because that's 19th century bottle glass. We can help date these sites with some of the archaeologists. We had a gentleman here ask earlier if we can date the abandonment or closure of railroads. If there are the right kinds of artifacts that can be dated, yes we can, especially if they're on abandoned grades. The red rectangular box is around this random cluster of rocks on the floodplain. If you are a floodplain or river ecologist, you probably see these random collections of rocks all the time. That one was particularly suspicious to me because of random collections of rocks I've seen at other Chinese labor camps elsewhere. Here's a historic image of a gold rush era camp from California, and the area in the red circle has a little outdoor hearth on it. They're U-shaped or hairpin shaped, and it's for putting their teapots or even using them as outdoor wok stoves. And we have some great historical information to back that up. Also, when we traveled to China, we saw some additional stoves that really show how this type of cooking carried over into the West. So again, we look at another view. We're along a slough now in the plains area. The Clark Fork River is out of the image and off to the right, the main channel, and this slough, of course, is on the left. My compass is thrown in there as a scale by maybe what would just appear to be a random collection of rocks to some people, but after looking at these U-shaped rock hearths for years, I see something there. And I believe that that is another element of one of the campsites, especially when taken in tandem with the types of artifacts that I've shown you. Blacksmiths were present at most of these sites. It's not like they could just go to Home Depot to repair things. The individual who is retired from the Burlington Northern Santa Fe who first found these sites went out with a metal detector to try to locate some of the metal artifacts, something I couldn't have done with just my non-invasive surface survey. And he found axe heads. These are broken pick pieces. I should show that to the people in Missoula. But these little tiny metal bits, I've got a red arrow going to what they are. Those are rock drill tips. You had to, in order to blast rock out of the way to make new grade, you'd use a rock drill to put a hole in, and then you put the charge in that hole. And so another intriguing signature of a railroad construction site are these areas or these bits of rock drills that have been cut off to be resharpened and reused by the blacksmith. And then of course your standard horseshoe, and somebody is definitely doing some hunting out there as well. When we tap back to our historical documents for a moment and consider that the Chinese were fishing and bringing their own fish elsewhere, a lot of the other research with the analysis of their foodways indicate that they're usually using local meat whenever they can. This is actually a really cool mattock that, if you look closely on it, and the image on top of the photo has a Chinese character that's been chiseled into the mattock. This is the Chinese character for feng, and it could be somebody's name, but it translates to abundant or plentiful or great or even handsome. So you could pick. Another site along the floodplain. This is another one of those rock drills, and along this floodplain is where our friend Gary found a rock drill that was still hammered in the ground at one of the corners of the floodplain. By the way, the reason this doesn't look so rusty is because he treated all of the metal artifacts to try to save them from further deterioration. There's a whole world of artifact conservation that might have done something differently, but if he didn't dive in and do this in the 80s, we might not actually have these artifacts. So he's actually done us quite a service. So what do we do as archaeologists when we're out there? Just to give you a quick methodological approach. Now that you know what to look for, I'm getting away from digging. The more I work in Montana, the more I'm thinking that we have so much to learn on the surface that we don't always need to dig. And if you look at the array of pin flags along this slough, you can see there are artifacts everywhere. I visited this slough a year ago, and it looked entirely different a year ago. I have a lot of questions about that and archaeological site formation processes that I'd like to talk to you guys about later. Again, looking on the ground, we have a lot of fragments, little pieces of this brownware that I talked about serving as food storage jars. While we only have the small piece that I'm pointing at with the pointer here, knowing the material culture, oh my gosh, that's from these large food storage jars. The item in the image in the bottom that has the little spout and the lip, we actually find fragments of those. Those held soy sauce. It's called a spouted jar. Another view of our bamboo bowls and all of the bamboo fragments that are so distinct. And this wasn't like fine, fancy china. This was workers' china. And so after we put all of our pin flags on the ground, we GPS our points in, and we look closely to see if we can define activity areas and recreate the site and maybe find out where the prostitutes were staying. Still no evidence at this particular site. If I just give you the breakdown, I've shown a few sample of artifacts just to show you sort of how they are on the surface. But in the far left, this is one of those historic brown bottle glass fragments. That's part of a whole deposit that includes all kinds of alcohol bottles. None of the Chinese artifacts. Moving on to the right, the next small square or next small circle is another fragment of that bamboo rice bowl. Hard to tell the little tiny fragment that's in the upper middle, but that's a winter green color. It's called winter green ware, another distinguished feature of or type of artifact from the Chinese. The middle circle here, which I'm now putting the cursor on, was full of just that brownware and barrel hoops. It had the appearance of an area for food stores. It was distinct from the others. So what I think we have going on at a site like this is maybe an area for alcohol consumption and maybe where the other camp was that was non-Chinese. And then the Chinese camp strung along here on the slough. We can't understand why we aren't finding any archaeological remains out here on the main floodplain. By the way, this is the Clark Fork River coming through. And it may be that there was a larger camp there. Maybe we're seeing the tip of it, but the railroad grade has now gone over that. Lots of questions we still have. And as a by the way, this is a base from an aqua bottle, and I don't know if everybody can see that. I'll put the cursor on it for everybody in Missoula. It says C and Company. That's a company from St. Louis, Missouri that only used that manufacturer mark on the bottom of its bottles between about 1875 and the early 1880s. So this is where we use historical documents about object manufacturing to help give us some tighter dates. If I was suspicious in any way about this maybe not being from 1882-83 when the Northern Pacific was coming through here, I could use these artifacts to fact check myself. Falls within the time range.
Kelly, how long would people stay at the camps? How long were they there?
That is a wonderful question. It kind of depends on the difficulty of the grade ahead. They might have been there for a few weeks. They might have been there for a month. The big camp at Cabinet Landing was occupied for quite some time because it was kind of a jumping off point. So I think some of these sites would have only been there for a few weeks. I think, but they were, because in the fall of 1882, they were starting to, they had just gotten past Cabinet Landing. By February of 1883, they were at some of the sites in the Plains area. So if you think of how many in between, this is just a few weeks, if not less, at each site. It's like chasing ghosts. It's hard enough to find an archaeological signature of somebody who maybe lived at a site for a year. These are very subtle. And it's not like they were wealthy people leaving behind all of their stuff. For the most part, they were transient and moving on. What we are finding is what was broken and left behind. Although I bet people were really bummed they lost those coins.
Is there a seasonality? If they're moving that fast, you must find winter things here, spring things here, summer things here.
Exactly. So right now, the sites that we have looked at, and this is all very preliminary. This is the first swath. This is rough cut, exactly. These sites were all winter sites. Makes me have all kinds of questions about what happened in the spring of 1883. We need to look at weather records and all that to start to understand the formation processes. And archaeologists already don't play with the full deck. We already are missing so much. Yes, you can take that for whatever it's worth. But with these sites that were occupied for such short amount of time, oh my gosh, it's even worse. But the value isn't just one site. The value is looking at all of the sites and considering them as a collective and what can we understand from this whole suite of information. And I have been so frustrated. I'm a visual person and I want to see what one of these camps looked like. And I feel like the historical documents haven't done it justice. So we hired an artist who does archaeological illustration. He takes the bits and bobs and the pieces that we find and the landscape, and he tried to reconstruct a section of the Chinese camp at Last Chance here on the floodplain, just to give those of us living today an opportunity to see what it would have looked like. And this view in the upper right-hand corner is the Flathead River headed south from Last Chance Camp. And you can almost see where that next site is, where the cluster of trees juts out. That's going to be the next site. That's that peninsula that we looked at earlier that had the remnant flats on it. I could not find any of the areas where these tent flats would have been when I went out in the last year. I wish I could have been there in the 80s when this gentleman did the initial work. Another issue. This is that winter greenware that I noted earlier. And in the upper right-hand corner, I'm showing you a cute little version of it. And I say cute little, notice that is a centimeter scale. These were tiny teacups or wine cups, though the winter green could have been in bowl form. But what I think we have on the surface here at one of these sites are fragments from a teacup because of their size. When Gary and I and other archaeologists went out about a year ago in August 2015, we found this collection of the winter green at one particular location. The cruise that I was out with less than 2 weeks ago, this is this same artifact. It's the only one there now. Well, that's because there was a year that passed. Who knows what happened in just that 1 year to this site? Where the heck did all these little fragments go? And the big one is the one that should have stayed, I would think. So there's that. This is a dark slide. It might be easier for the people in Missoula to see, I'm not sure. I'm going to use my cursor to put right on the fragment of one of those black god bottle glass fragments, shown right here. 19th century bottle. And you can see that it is all but getting swallowed by the river. We're at a site that's along a slough at this point. I have some other photos of artifacts underwater in the slough, but they just didn't turn out. We actually think we need to do some underwater archaeology. This is another view of that slough, and the white dashed line is our guesstimate of how far this site might actually extend underwater today. When I mentioned the desire to do some research with weather records, one of my questions is, was that slough frozen over in February of 1883 when they would have been at this site? Did they set up a camp on the frozen slough? And we've got this smattering of artifacts along the edge of the slough. Do we need to be doing underwater archaeology here or maritime archaeology? The water isn't that deep, and unfortunately, it's a slough, so every time you even step in it, it gets all murky because the sediments just blur your vision. I actually think the best way to do an underwater survey is to paddleboard that slough. I'm a paddleboarder, so I have an ulterior motive here. And it just so happens that the private landowner with whom we're working is a paddleboarder too. And so now we're entering into citizen science. We talked to her about the site, and she's very excited about us doing work there. She's keeping an eye on the site, and she's going to go back immediately in the spring before the weeds come and take a look at things. She's going to paddleboard it whenever she can, because that stretch of the Clark Fork is pretty dangerous, starting about now. So she's now out there doing weekly surveys for us. I asked her to start taking photos. I mean, I think that we have to have our approach to documenting this site even more fine-grained than going back to the same artifact and taking a photo year after year. It's happening faster than that. I'm guessing you guys probably have a multitude of insights that might help me but better understand the formation and the deconstruction processes of a site like this.
So do you know when the slough was created? It looks like almost it's an impoundment of the railroad. Is it natural?
So I don't know. That is because we were just there. All of these questions just came up. What I would have loved to have done is had time between now and then to do that level of research and look into weather records. There is a master's student who's going to turn this into a thesis, and hopefully right now, Kate, if you're watching, right now she's actually looking into the archival records to figure that out. The Northern Pacific Railroad has some material in our archives at the University of Montana's K. Ross Toole archives. So we're going to start looking there, but we may have to go to St. Paul, Minnesota, where the Northern Pacific's main archives are. There's a lot of people who've done this kind of research more in terms of social history, but they weren't looking for the subtleties like, yes, and then we cut off this area from the river and a slough was created. That's $1 million question for me right now. And I can't seem to find anybody who's done like an archaeological site formation processes on sloughs in the Rocky Mountain area. So anyway, it's time for that. So just to think things through here, I invoke Nancy Grimm and colleagues with their research thinking about urban ecological systems. These aren't urban, but I would argue that these are industrial ecological systems. And while that swath is really only 200 feet wide, what if they were creating things like sloughs? There's a lot going on. Even when railroad workers would fell trees up the line for ties for the railroad, they'd clear out obstacles from the river so that they could float the ties down to the construction sites. So even activities like that are altering the natural ecology of the river systems. And you think that's subtle, just pulling a few logs out. But for those of you nodding here in the background, you know that is not that has a vast impact on the site. This is the last chance view again. Those longhorns were grazing there frequently. They graze there frequently. It's a ranch. There is a literature on the impacts of cattle on archaeological sites. And I think it would be really interesting to start to look not only at the impacts of cattle, but also flooding, erosion, and all of these other issues. Unfortunately, I don't know if my colleagues at Stanford are interested in that. This is sort of the thing that I'm interested in. And in my past research and work with Institute on Ecosystems, I can't help but come at this very interesting social history and social archaeology project with all of these environmental questions. These are just some examples of the types of geoarchaeology or environmental archaeological references that are out there. And I have a lot more work to do now that I've seen that slough site. I can't seem to find decent information in the region about floodplain or slough impacts or processes and how archaeological sites might be impacted like that. These are more general, often have to do with other regions in the world. And as we've noted, there are subtle processes happening perhaps month by month. And I think that would be a really interesting addition to the geoarchaeological literature. And definitely a good contribution now that we know that we're living in the Anthropocene officially, right? Going from those more environmentally oriented, I'm wondering what time it is. Oh, okay, it's about that time, that's good. While the more environmentally oriented approaches are definitely an area in which I'm interested, there are a lot of publications right now emphasizing the importance of social history and social archaeology. The flagship journal for my discipline, Historical Archaeology, in 2015 did this thematic issue that was entirely dedicated to Chinese railroad workers. Stanford has recently worked with the Society for Historical Archaeology to put out this book for the public called Finding Hidden Voices. One of my colleagues at Stanford has written a theoretical paper on a trans-Pacific archaeology of the modern world, reminding people not just to think about your individual sites, but connect those with the home sites in China. And that's why we ended up making these trips to China, and there's some really exciting connections there. Right now, Stanford has a book coming out. I just turned my paper in about a week ago. It will be an edited volume, including perspectives of historians and archaeologists and American studies experts and Asian studies scholars, all collectively together telling the story of Stanford and the railroad workers. And I wanted to focus on just Montana. And the funny thing is they said, you know, those Northern Pacific sites in Montana are great, but could you write up a section on the Central Pacific and Donner Summit? And we're okay if you emphasize the environment, Kelly, but we'd like you to emphasize the environmental extremes that people from Southern China would have faced if they left Southern China and ended up on Donner Summit and then connected with Montana. So I have a previous life of working in the Donner Summit area with the Donner Party, actually, specifically, and nobody wanted to work in that area, you know, very foreboding tale. The Chinese came in and blasted through solid granite to make tunnels, and their summit camp was occupied for, I think, several years. And that camp is even down to nothing but traces, because people have been looting and collecting for it, thinking they were finding fragments of the Donner Party, but they weren't. So as we wrap up here, I wanted to show you a view of the railroad grade up there in the same area of the Plains Paradise region, but in the winter. Perhaps this is the scene that they would have experienced. And I go to acknowledgments, and thank you all profusely for listening. And I'd love to take questions from anybody here or any of you in Missoula.
Thank you so much. Other questions?
Well, I could always ask dozens of questions, but one is what you just did on the worldwide thing. So we were having a railroad boom here because we had big country to master. And was there anything like that going on in Russia and in China? Were we drawing all of those?
Yeah, in fact, there's a railroad in China called the Wusung Road, and an American went over to China with Chinese railroad workers who had built the Transcontinentals to construct that. I don't know the story with Russia, but our transcontinental story was a shot that was heard around the world, and really epic when you consider how fast it really went. And it was all in the name of extractive industry. Industrial capitalism ruled, and the rest of the world did jump on board pretty quickly. And I think it would be interesting, actually, in terms of these trans-Pacific connections, to go to China and actually study the evidence of camps there. Though there's so much development, there's not a lot left. I attempted to do that a few years ago when I was working in the Tahoe region and working on Chinese logging sites. And I so dearly wanted to understand them, and this was so long ago, it was years before the whole Stanford project, and I was hoping that there might be Chinese logging sites in China that we might use to help interpret what we were finding here. And the Chinese colleagues that we reached out to at that time said, you're not gonna find anything, you know, and the development is crazy over there. Though on my visits to southern China with the Stanford delegation in the past, when you get to the rural villages in southern China, the ancestral villages where most of the railroad workers came, they are still living. Do I have a photo in here? Can I actually bring you there? These are, my B-sides photos are all here. Yes, I can. There's one image here in the upper right. Guangdong province shown here in yellow is where most of the railroad workers came from. And then if I scoot one over, these villages in this 5-county area, or the Wu Yi, are self-sufficient. They're laid out according to the principles of feng shui. They are a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the preservation of the buildings. They have been there at least 700 years, since the end of the Ming Dynasty. And what was pretty crazy for me is when we visited some of these villages to come into contact with the bamboo ware and the brownware and all of these artifacts that I had seen in the American West, and that were part of daily life for them. There's a whole group of scholars there who specialize in the overseas Chinese. But from that perspective, they're going through attics in these buildings looking for journals or diaries or anything that they can find. And they're finding, like, they're happy if they find a remittance notice representing the money that somebody sent home to their village. So they were pretty excited to be able to hear what life was like on the other side when the Chinese railroad workers went to Gold Mountain, as they called California and the rest of North America for a while. Yeah, so the beauty of this kind of archaeology is that we can create snapshots of daily life in these camps. And when you add in the environment as another factor, and considering this subtropical area from which they came, what some environmental extremes to deal with, and navigating unfamiliar landscapes and doing so successfully. And one of the famous quotes from the railroad barons when they were discussing bringing over Chinese laborers was, "They built the Great Wall, didn't they?"
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How were they recruited? Shanghaied? Excuse me.
So yeah, no. What was happening in southern China, these farming villages were experiencing all kinds of political unrest and famine, and they were poor and starving. And the individual villages would pool together all of their resources to send 1 or 2 young men over to the US to work on the railroad, and they would send money back home. And the thing is, depending on which railroad they worked for, the Central Pacific would make them pay for lodging and supplies, but the non-Chinese had all of that covered. The Northern Pacific actually gave them tents, but it also looks like they're creating their own food, or creating options for their own food. But they still sent money home. And the money home went a long way so that they were valorized, they were appreciated. These villages were building schools and community buildings and expanding their infrastructure. And part of the reason it's a World Heritage Site is each village today is marked by a large tower called Bailu. It's like a siege tower, because bandits would come roving from throughout the hills and attack these villages that were now doing well, and everybody in the village would go into the siege tower. There are still little holes in each one for a rifle barrel to fit through. They would hole up until the bandits left. Those are 20th century architectural marvels that dot the landscape because of what the railroad workers were able to send home.
Wow.
Yeah, yes, and then you.
In your observations, Did you ever uncover any evidence of the use of wildlife or observations of wildlife in those camps?
So, yes, at the slough site, we found some turtle carcasses on the surface. And this again was just not even 2 weeks ago. I couldn't tell how long those turtle carcasses had been there. I don't think I would have been so bothered by it if there was just one, if there should be dead turtles along a slough, one would think. The fact that we had a minimum number of 2 individuals kind of threw me off, especially because they were in association with the clusters of artifacts. So I'm definitely wondering there. At one of the other sites, a slide just for you. This is modern and definitely not used by them. I think it's a bighorn sheep carcass that was just laying at the base of a cliff. It just made me think, I bet they were seeing bighorn sheep for the first time. I bet they were seeing bison for the first time and bears. And there's a whole other story of wildlife. God, I wish we could find one of their journals. Because I don't think we're going to get all of that unless we actually can find a latrine or a food refuse pit. Unfortunately, for the most part, their camps appear to be pretty clean. And, if you go to a European American logging camp, for example, or a European American railroad construction camp, there's often a canned dump. Canned dump representing the types of foods that were there, but there's always animal bones intermingled. So you can usually tell a really great story about foodways. The Chinese were more clean. Instead of finding a can dump, we'll find cans with perforations in them. In fact, I think I had an example of one earlier. I think we're running out of time, but I'll show you this last page. Get beyond my B-sides. It looks like they're recycling, reusing things. Here we go. So in the lower right-hand corner, there's some cans with perforations in them. Don't know if they're using them as steam, to steam vegetables, like as a cooking implement or as a strainer, but they're using so much of it that it makes it difficult. Moreover, when I have, and this goes back to the Sierra Nevada, when I have excavated those U-shaped hearths, we have found bits of bone, but they're crumbled down to nothing because they're chopping up the animals into smaller bits for wok-style cooking. They're not impossible to identify, but I wasn't able to do any identification based on the skeletal morphology. We would have had to do bone histology or maybe DNA, but the DNA might not work because they looked like they were charred. That was a good question. Sorry, I rambled a lot. You had a question too.
Yeah, it's pretty similar, and thanks so much. This was a super interesting and different talk that we've seen, so I appreciate that very much. I'm wondering, taking those sites in a whole, like you're mentioning, in terms of as a complete set, are there any patterns that you've seen with them in some, either enculturation, like an increased adoption of American goods, or persistence of Chinese goods?
Yeah. So it seems like the clothing that we're finding is, for the most part, European American style. And we aren't finding clothing. We find suspender clasps. We find buttons. We find fragments of footwear, like a part of a leather boot that has the grommet still visible. So it looks, for the most part, like they are adopting Western dress. But then when you look at some of the historic photos, a lot of them are wearing the traditional Chinese sun hats. And I think at first they might have worn more traditional clothing, but with each passing year, it was the best the market affords. And it looks like, for the most part, the Chinese middlemen merchants were more or less supplying Chinese food, opium, and medicinal remedies, and that they were using other European American styled material. The alcohol bottles were all coming from the US. But they might not have all held alcohol. Reuse, recycle.
This has been a great talk. So thanks a lot, Kelly.
Thank you guys.